South Carolina is holding the last presidential primary before Super Tuesday. It's likely to be the deciding factor in the future of some candidates' campaigns, with a few possibly ending.
South Carolina, the state Joe Biden calls his firewall, but in reality, it's his fourth quarter and he needs a Hail Mary.
Are you going to win?
Yes. All right. Because South Carolina is the trajectory to winning the Democratic nomination.
South Carolina looks favorable for Biden. He got an endorsement from Representative James Clyburn this week, and in a new Monmouth University poll, Biden is ahead of national frontrunner Senator Bernie Sanders.
One of the serious things we got to do is make sure that we defeat the most dangerous president in the modern history of this country, Donald Trump.
South Carolina is basically do or die for some Democratic presidential hopefuls, like Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Are you in this fight with me? Let's do this.
Senator Amy Klobuchar.
And I'm asking you to vote for me. Thank you so much, everyone.
Businessman Tom Steyer.
I just don't believe that having the government take over big parts of the economy is a smart thing to do.
And former Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
Not all of the answers have to come from Washington, but more of the funding should.
Another former mayor, Mike Bloomberg, isn't on the ballot in South Carolina, focusing instead on later contests.
Well, there is plenty to look at on the race to the White House, and we are joined by politics reporter at Axios, Steph Kight. Welcome to Weekend Edition, Steph. Let's talk about Joe Biden first. He's come out with a strong message this week saying, I will win South Carolina. Is it make or break for Joe?
Yeah, he says he will win South Carolina, and he has to win South Carolina really to keep his campaign going. And I think it's interesting to note that, for a while there, Bernie Sanders was seeming to come close to Joe Biden in the polls, even in South Carolina. But following the debate earlier this week, we really saw Biden pull away from Bernie Sanders again, and Sanders drop a little bit in South Carolina. Of course, Bernie Sanders is still by far the leading candidate in national polls. But this is really crucial for Biden to keep going. And there's a chance after South Carolina's primary that we start to see some of these other moderates drop out, which could also make it easier for Biden to last a little bit longer, to get more support from the voters out there who want a more moderate president.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, Joe Biden? His whole campaign has been on life support the last few weeks, and this would almost be his final throw of the dice. I know it's very early, but Bernie Sanders just got out of the block so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. This really is the last chance for Biden to prove himself. And, we noticed at the debate when he was asked whether he will drop out if he didn't win South Carolina, Biden didn't really say anything, just saying, he plans to win South Carolina. But again, Bernie Sanders seems to keep gaining support, especially given the fact that the moderate vote is so split over so many candidates, whereas people in the Democratic Party who want a more progressive candidate, who want someone like Bernie Sanders, are all united around him, really giving him the enthusiasm that he needs to propel his campaign forward.
There was a tweet from Joe Biden this week as well, Steph, about Sanders not being honest about how much Medicare for All will cost and who will pay for it, saying that the American people deserve to know the truth.
Yeah, this has been something that many critics of Bernie Sanders have talked long about, that he isn't upfront with how much this program will cost and how much it will cost American taxpayers. And, of course, this comes with the criticism he faced at the debate over him being a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. And that's something that a lot of people are concerned about. It's something that he's tried to hedge and explain to the American people who maybe don't quite understand what he means by being a democratic socialist, and maybe only think of authoritarian socialist countries, so that he's trying to move past this. But that's one of the biggest issues keeping him back from people like Joe Biden or Michael Bloomberg, who are probably more likely to be able to win those voters in the middle and maybe win over some of the supporters of Trump in 2016 who are looking for someone else's support in 2020.
What about young Pete? You would think that South Carolina is always going to be a challenge for him, very conservative part of the world. He's a former military man. He's openly gay. How's he going here?
Well, one of the biggest things hurting Mayor Pete Buttigieg in South Carolina in particular is the fact that he just is not popular among Black voters, and that's a really crucial voting base in South Carolina. And he just can't get past some of the controversy of his past when he was mayor of South Bend, and that's really been the biggest issue for him moving forward in South Carolina. And that also could be crucial for him. His campaign in particular is struggling to raise enough money to keep him in the race, despite, a great showing in Iowa early on and a decent showing in New Hampshire. He's consistently come close to Bernie Sanders in these early states, but he needs to do more. He needs to keep the momentum going in order to raise enough funds to stay in this for the long haul.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, won't it, with this particular race. But South Carolina Democratic Representative James Clyburn, he has in fact endorsed Joe Biden and is sending out a strong message about the fear of the country if Donald Trump is re-elected again. How significant is James Clyburn's endorsement to Joe Biden?
It's very significant. James Clyburn's endorsement matters a lot in South Carolina. It always has. He's an important person in South Carolina and among the Black voting base. And so this is huge for Biden. And it also signals some fear among moderate Democrats about the idea of Bernie Sanders running against Donald Trump. I think, we've heard from lots of moderates that they are concerned about Bernie Sanders being the nominee, and they're seeing this momentum. And I think that was a huge part that played a huge role in Clyburn coming out and endorsing Joe Biden and saying, no, this is the candidate that we need to back. I think it points to a lot of that concern and growing fear among Democrats about where this race is going and how they think Bernie Sanders would do in a matchup against Trump versus someone more moderate like Joe Biden.
It would be fascinating, wouldn't it? I mean, you are talking two ends of the spectrum, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And a lot of people just think that, Bernie is too controversially the other way to be able to compete. Two questions in one here. How do you think that would all play out if it was Bernie Sanders? And can Michael Bloomberg take the inside run and really make a presence through the course of the next few months?
First of all, I think we all said that Donald Trump was too controversial to win when he was running in the Republican primary in 2016. And if you look at the polls, he actually had more united Republican support of his campaign at this point in that cycle than Bernie Sanders does or anyone else does in this cycle. So I think, to say that someone is too extreme is something that we need to be careful of. Could it make it more? Could it be easier for Trump to beat Bernie Sanders? Possibly. If I've been talking to the Trump campaign, and they seem very excited about the fact that they could run against Bernie Sanders, and I think that's something that scares some Democrats that the Trump campaign is so confident about running against Bernie Sanders and seems to be less confident about running against someone like Joe Biden. So how this plays out is uncertain, but there certainly seems to be a little bit of confidence from the Trump campaign about Bernie Sanders, but also the extremes sometimes work, as we've seen in 2016.
We're running out of time, but finally, the biggest day of the US election race so far is going to be Super Tuesday. This is going to be the first time that California will take part in Super Tuesday. How do you think it will go? I mean, it's going to be a big one.
Yeah, I think Super Tuesday is obviously something that we're all watching very closely. And to the earlier question with Michael Bloomberg, this is the first time that we really get to see Michael Bloomberg compete, see whether he's actually getting support, see whether his hundreds of millions of dollars he's been spending on advertisements actually pay off when it comes to primaries, if he has enough people who are actually sold on what he is saying that he can do, if people actually come out and vote for him, is something that me and my colleagues at Axios are watching very closely, or whether he just isn't able to pull it off and we are back to Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden as kind of the two competing Democrats in this race.
Well, you articulating before about when Donald Trump came into power is a reason why we can't dismiss Michael Bloomberg at all, because wouldn't that be fascinating, the battle of the billionaires? They don't like each other. It'd be almost a reality TV show in itself if these two went head to head.
Oh, absolutely. It would be, two people who are in some ways very alike, New York billionaires who ran in the same circles during a certain time, but also completely different in the policies they support and their style. But I do think, Trump sees some of himself in Bloomberg, and Bloomberg is certainly taking the Trump strategy and implementing it in his own campaign.
There's an interesting comparison when you look at the amount of money that Michael Bloomberg's putting in. For example, for January alone, it was around $221 million, whereas Bernie Sanders, he raised money, up to around $25 million just for the month of January. How significant is that comparison?
It's very significant. You know, money goes a long way in American politics, and Michael Bloomberg has a lot of it. He has almost limitless resources that he can pour into targeting specific states, and he can hire the best consultants. He can hire the best political people on his team, and so he's pulling out all the stops, and that matters. But what money can't buy is enthusiasm. And that's something that we see clearly when we look at Bernie Sanders' fundraising, when we look at all the small dollar donations that he's able to bring in from the average American who supports his cause. And it makes them really difficult candidates to compare, especially because of the way they're running their campaigns. They're completely different in the way they're coming to raising funds and spending money and who they're targeting. So it'll be really interesting to see who wins out in this primary.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Bernie's a man of the people, isn't it? That he gets that currency through not being a wealthy man, but having all these people align themselves and feel, I can be like Bernie Sanders. Then Bloomberg goes and buys half the advertising at the Super Bowl. It's a fascinating time. So good to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for coming on.